and Manhood. Please do use the Q&A function for any questions. We will try to answer as many questions as possible during the Q&As, and please have a pen and paper in case you want to jot down any websites, resources or useful phrases. We will be recording the workshop. A copy will be available for those who couldn't attend, and Trigger Hub may use the video for marketing purposes. So introducing ourselves, Simon Thomas, would you like to start?
A quick intro. So I'm Simon, surname's Thomas. I don't know why I just said that. I'm a broadcaster. I've been broadcasting for about 20 years, started with Blue Peter. Then was on Sky for many, many years. I still do broadcasting, still work in sport, but I speak a lot about mental health, particularly men's mental health, and speak quite a bit about grief because I lost my first wife, Gemma, 5 years ago, very suddenly. So yeah, I speak about those two areas. I've written a book, like you have, different subjects. So yeah, I'm a sort of jack of all trades, master of none. That's probably the best way of describing me, but I'm ostensibly a broadcaster.
And Shaka?
Yeah, I'm an artist from North London, Tottenham, Broadwater Farm.
Arsenal or Tottenham?
Arsenal. Okay. It's got to be.
Only because they're top of the league.
Do you know what? I'm not even going to go into that. But I wouldn't jinx it. I know it's start running off my mouth, but it's looking good.
Yeah.
But yeah, artist, mental health advocate, TED Talk speaker. My mental health journey started from when I got sectioned in 2012. That just led the whole journey, and I've been trying to help people ever since with my story.
I am a former international rugby player turned mental health advocate. I helped to co-found a mental health and wellbeing charity called Tidy Butt, and I'm also now an inspirational and keynote speaker.
Amazing. I'm Scarlett Clark, the founder and CEO of Smart Girl Tribe, which is the UK's #1 female empowerment organisation. I'm author of the Smart Girls Handbook. I'm a TV commentator on women's issues, a female empowerment expert for Harvard University, and ambassador of the NSPCC and a UK delegate for the United Nations.
Jeez, that is a CV.
No, it's just easy to reel off. Okay, so diving into the first topic, would you like to introduce it?
First topic, male vulnerability. I don't know who wants to start this off, but why is vulnerability so powerful? That's what I said. I don't know who
We all look at each other.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think it's the key part of really helping ourselves to a better state of mental health, to our best state of mental health is being vulnerable. I think so many of us wear so many masks, we lie so much, we're in huge amounts of denial about how bad our problems really are. And I think until we can be completely vulnerable and, remove the mask, lay down all those old, adages like man up and push through it, all those that kind of crap, being completely vulnerable, it is a superpower.
Yeah, for sure.
It allows us to bear ourselves, and all of our weaknesses, but then to rise up through it. And showing that kind of weakness, but coming through it just makes a better, stronger man, mentally, physically, emotionally. That's undoubtedly. It is the cornerstone of all of it, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a powerful thing, being vulnerable, and I think what through what we're trying to do tonight, what many others are trying to do, particularly in the male space, is try and flip on its head what vulnerability is seen as, because too often it's seen as a sign of weakness, which is where that phrase "man up" will come from.
Yes.
If you're struggling with your mental health, or you're struggling with the loss of a job, a breakdown of a relationship, whatever it might be, the admission that I'm struggling with that is too often seen as weakness, particularly as men. And so we are given those awful phrases like, be strong, stay strong, man up, whatever it might be. And for me, what it does is it, as a guy, best, I'm sorry, this is a little bit far away, but if this bottle top is your problem, whatever you're struggling with. So say for me back in 2017, it's really pronounced anxiety and panic attacks and depression that led to me having to stand away from my job at Sky Sports at the time. For an awful long time through that period, that this bottle top represents what I was struggling with. And my response to that was to clench the fist, kind of my whole being around that problem, so that when people came into contact with me, they wouldn't see the problem because I put my mask on. And you're so right, like putting a mask on when you're struggling is absolutely exhausting.
Oh.
It just is exhausting, but so often as men, we do it. And we pass by each other in the corridor, and it was at work, and I'd be in the outside broadcast truck ahead of a game for Sky, and people say, "You all right?" "Yeah, I'm all right, not bad, not bad." And all the time, that kind of fist is tightly clenched around the problem that sits right in the center of the fist. And actually, it's an amazing show of strength to eventually, as a guy, just do that and say, "Do you know what? Right now, I'm struggling. Right now, I'm not in a good place. Right now, I'm struggling with anxiety, and it's making my job really difficult." That should never, ever, but it sadly still is in some places, be seen as weakness. That's strength. And it's just having that as a guy, and as a woman, actually, is having that ability to go, this is a really strong thing to do, to actually say, I'm struggling. It's not weakness, and it's flipping it on its head.
But how did you realize it was a strong thing? How did you arrive at that point?
So
that's the problem I feel like a lot of men have,
yeah,
is understanding that it's a strong thing, because they understand it's weakness wherever they got that belief from. But how do you flip that?
because ultimately, when you're dealing with any of these things, you want to get on the road to recovery. You want to get yourself to a better place where you're on more solid ground. And when you're going through mental health problems in particular, you'll know this. You feel like everything, the foundations of your life are just shuddering like they're in a massive earthquake. And it makes everything feel impossible. I remember my job that I loved doing. And listen, we're a Millwall dressing room. I used to come here in the Football League days. I wasn't in the dressing room, but in the studio outside by the pitch. And my job I could do because that's what I was trained to do. That's what I was good at. When I was going through mental health problems, everything became impossible. And the longer I was kind of burying it and not speaking about it, the worse it got. And then I remember when it all came to a head in 2017, I was doing a Chelsea game, so not too far from here, bigger club. And people had spotted that something wasn't right. And it was my producer, Billy. And I respect Billy for doing this, because what he didn't do is he didn't do it in front of people. He took me to one side. He took me away from the OB truck, just round to the back. And he just put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Are you okay? Because you just do not seem okay. You're not yourself. You're not engaging with people. What's going on?" And I just remember as I began to, I couldn't hide it any longer. I just said, "Mate, I'm in a really bad place." And just the moment I said that, you could feel it's like being, it's not that everything became okay at that point, but almost like just being cleansed, like this weight coming off your shoulder, because you were being vulnerable. You were going, "Look, Billy, yeah, I know I'm going to have to be on air in an hour's time. We can't get someone in this late notice to do it. So I know I'm going to have to do that." But actually, I felt that kind of, that surge of like, okay, something's changing here, because I've unclenched the fist and said, "Billy, yeah, I could have just gone, no, I'm fine, mate. Just a rubbish night's sleep. I'm fine. You know, let's crack on. We're on air in an hour. Everything will be fine. I'll get the best out of Alan Pardew and Jamie Redknapp. Yeah, we'll crack on." I just went, I'm in trouble. And he thankfully was understanding. And I think at that point, that was a real game changer for me in terms of how I've dealt with things going forward. It's like the bloke thing would have been in the past, in me particular, would have been to say all that stuff. I just said, "Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah,
well, get on."
definitely.
But actually, it taught me that actually that is strength doing that. And actually it puts you, and it put me at that point on the road to recovery.
Also, one of the biggest myths when it comes to vulnerability is like with crying, especially that old saying that goes around that boys don't cry, or men don't cry. What's your relationship with crying? Like, how do you?
Yeah, I mean, being a rugby lad, it wasn't the thing to do.
Not even in the national anthem.
Well,
You see rugby players crying in the national anthem.
that's for the passion, right?
Yeah.
It's different. But if you got hurt or something went wrong in your personal life, you wouldn't want your kids or your wife or any of your friends to see you having a little drizz. So you kind of took yourself off, or had a little cry somewhere else. But I don't know, I think it's so important that we allow the emotions to flow through us. Like, instead of, like you said, holding on to all these, like trying to press them down, all these emotions, mental and physical, emotional feelings that are flowing through us. Like, if we just bottle them up constantly, don't allow ourselves to have a cry or tell someone how we're struggling, eventually they're going to start manifesting in different ways, like whether it's through disease or addiction, alcoholism, whatever it may be. So like that's unfortunately most of the time is we'll only allow ourselves to express when it is too late, you know, when it's rock bottom, when we're in crisis. Instead of addressing things or allowing things to be, I don't know, to share how we feel pre-crisis is such a, it's so hard to try and express to people like that is the right time to do it. But when you're in it, when you feel that, you know what it's like, when you feel at your worst mental health, or when you're having a really bad, tough time, like sometimes you can't help but go inward. And you just want it, you don't feel like expressing or talking or telling anyone. But knowing now in hindsight from hitting rock bottom myself, the best possible thing to do is to express. And if that means crying, you know, if that means sharing with people about how you feel, and that means like sharing with them that complete amount of darkness, if that means that you want to harm yourself or whatever it may be, like you got to get it off your chest. And like Simon said, the minute you got it off your chest, it's just like a weight off your shoulders. And then from that point, the person who you've had the bravery and the courage to speak to, you can then with that person as like a team, then take your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, whatever they may be, and go and have a talk with someone, nurse, professional, doctor, teammate, wherever it may be. But like crying is so important, right? Like it's so important.
And it's natural, like it's
such a relief
between men and females. You know what I mean? Like it's a normal thing for us to do.
I didn't pick up this bottle to use as a visual aid, but it's now become one. I picked it up to drink from. But just picking up the reason what you were saying there, because I've spoken about this a lot when it comes to grief. And grief is something that has to be expressed at some point. Obviously, you in the recent years lost your mum. I lost my dad a couple of years ago. I lost my first wife 5 years ago. And I know from my own experience, and I also know from speaking to others, that the grief has to come out at some point. And when it comes to mental health and we're struggling, or whether it comes to whatever mental struggles we have in life, if we don't deal with them, so if we don't express crying, that may be one of the manifestations of what you're feeling, so we suppress that. It's a little bit like, just imagine this is a bottle of fizzy drink and not just still water. It's, you know, all the time it's been shaken up and the pressure inside the bottle builds and it builds and it builds. Now, when I found that I would express my grief or my mental health problems through crying, it's just like someone gently just twisting the top off. You know that hiss you get from a fizzy drink. I should have brought a bottle of Coke for this visual aid, but it just lets some of the pressure out. Because if you don't, then at some point the thing's just going to explode. And you know, I think, you know, we do see men cry sometimes. Or the only reason I say about the national anthem is because often in rugby you do see that, the emotion of the occasion. But you're so right. If someone gets injured or is having a problem at home and starts crying in front of the guys, that's seen as like, I mean, when I was young, there were some terrible phrases used around boys crying. You know, you mentioned one of them, or we'd be called a big mouse. You know, that was another one. Like, I don't know if these phrases are still around. I hope they're not. They probably are, sadly, in some places. But it was just seen as a massive no-no for a guy to cry. And yet I found it, through everything I've been through, particularly in the last 5 years, is that it's another part of the healing process. It's an emotion that you're letting out, that it's expressing itself in the same way that I felt comfortable expressing anger. Obviously, I've tried to not too much express that anger at people, but particularly in the weeks after I went through sudden bereavement in 2017, when I could feel that anger welling up, rather than again forcing that lid down and stopping it coming out, I'd get out the house. I had quite a big garden where we lived in Berkshire at the time, and the River Thames was near the end of our garden. I'd just go down the end of the garden and shout. And they'd be like joggers on the other side of the river, just going. It's quite early in the morning because I never used to sleep very much, and I'd just shout. But it was important because, like, that was a very real emotion. I felt anger, I felt injustice at what had gone on. Now, if I suppress that, I'm probably going to go to an even darker place than I'm already in.
Definitely.
So I'd shout.
And you've got to get that poison out. I was watching it. Do we know who Gary Vee is? No?
Yes.
You know who Gary Vee is?
Yeah.
He was
Us in the middle of the
he was giving advice to someone, and he was saying, like, he was telling the person, you probably have things that you've never said out loud before. Just even said it out loud to yourself. And he was like, it's either you say it out loud to a therapist, or it's either you go to a forest somewhere and just get it out, but you need to just even hear what it sounds like.
Yeah.
It's just fostering in your mind, and you haven't even said it out loud. So I thought that was an important point. What you
No, it
mentioned.
is, yeah.
If you're not sharing it, you're storing it.
Yeah. Yes.
That's good.
Yes. Exactly.
You
like that one.
both have sons, so I would love to know what terminology do you use instead then? Because those phrases, those words, they are still used and they are still around now. So how are you raising your sons to think differently? What terminology are you using?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge, right? Like, you know, I got my youngest is 15, my eldest son's like 23. So it's hard, you know. I try, obviously being where I am now, you know, almost chalk and cheese considering, you know, where I was if you pre-sobriety and post-sobriety, like two different dads almost. So like this new dad, I suppose, if you want to look at it from their point of view, is this like very open, very humble, very connected, present type of dad, whereas before was this kind of wild hooligan stroke, you know, rogue that was, but also in a way had good and bad traits. Whereas now it's like, you know, I encourage them to express how they feel. So like if they want to speak to me, like I all know, like any human beings have got some form of trauma to get off their chests, you know, whether it's some phase in our lives, whether it's grief or, you know, whether it's actual like some sort of childhood experience, which I mean we all have it to some extent. But I encourage both my boys to offload and to try and speak to, you know, whether it's professionals or teachers or me, and, you know, but you can only lend a hand. And, you know, you can't, like the saying, you can only take a horse to water is, you know, the truest thing. And sometimes it's really hard to understand that powerlessness over your children, is that, you know, you want to help them as much as they want, but until they want your help, like it's not gonna.
And I was going to mention
really
that.
Hard.
I was also going to say, like, it normally takes crisis point for you to get there, which is sad.
So sad.
Because it takes crisis, and some people don't recover well after the crisis point. If it was guaranteed that everyone's going to recover well after the crisis, then I wouldn't mind the crisis point taking place. But some people are never the same. But how do you?
Some people don't even come out of it, right?
Some people, exactly.
Yeah. I think I think with Ethan, one of the biggest lessons I've had to learn over the last 5 years is as his counsellor said, so he, after he lost his mum, had a lot of work with Grief Encounter, amazing child bereavement charity. He did loads of work with him. And he's just turned 13, so he's got a teenager in the house. So that comes with loads of different challenges. They're changing physically, emotionally, mentally. And they said you've got to be careful because of what he's been through, that you can read too much into everything. So if there's a slight change in mood or he goes very quiet, it's got to be because his mum died. Well, that might be true, but it may well not be true. It might be something else completely. And the biggest lesson I learned, because I kind of had in the sort of 18 months after his mum died, I had kind of a crash course in solo parenting, where suddenly everything's on your shoulders and you're learning very quickly about how you go about raising a son on your own. And, you know, I've remarried since then. I share that now with my amazing wife, Dorina, and she's an incredible stepmom to him. But there was that period where it's very much on you. And I think the biggest lesson I learned, which I've kind of now carried into where he's at in life and where I'm at in life now, is keeping the door open for conversations. You can't, when Liam's so right, you can't put pressure on them, you can't force a conversation out of them, and because that can work the other way, can work against you. Like, what's wrong, son? Come on, you've got to tell me, Well, if he's not ready to tell you, he won't. But I always felt it was important, and I learned this early on, because he'd have lots of questions in the immediate weeks and months after his mother passed away, about ultimately he was trying to make sense of how life was going to work. I'm sorry, that was Siri just butting in. Silly what? Very helpful for lots of things, not for this. But he'd asked lots of questions, because what he was trying to do was make sense of how life is going to work going forward. Siri's not going to help you with that. And so it was question after question, and some of them are really difficult to answer. You know, questions about what we're going to do with his mum's clothes. And that was coming 3 days after his mum had died. I'm just like, I can't even go there yet. What I learned very quickly, and this is what I take now into parenting now, in terms of when he hits troubles or he wants to talk about something, is I recognized early on that all those questions were ultimately about him trying to make sense of the world going forward, trying to work out, would there be some semblance of family security again? It will be different to what came before, but will there be some semblance of security again? All those questions were based on that. And so if I refuse to answer them, just go, do you know what? I do a very dad thing. I don't want to talk about this right now. You're in your head going, that's too difficult a question. I can't be bothered. Even just, I'm not answering it. I can't be bothered. The more times you say that, bit by bit, the door closes. And then eventually it slams shut. And your boy goes, I can't ever ask Dad about any of this, because every time we get that reaction out of him. So I've always wanted him to know, and I always say this to him, just to remind you, if you hit any problems, you know, if there's anything going at school, it's not forcing it out of him. It's just going, you know, if I'm sensing something's changed, or my wife Dorina senses something, to say, you know, everything okay, you know. And I actually find this is just a practical tip, so I'm waffling on, but this is something I've noticed, and lots of people say this, is that sometimes I think when you're having a conversation with your kids, and actually anyone for that example, when you sit in front of them and you eyeball them like this, it's sometimes a more difficult conversation. But I found just the other day when we were walking into town side by side, so you're not eyeballing each other, just having a bit of a chat with him, and he was, I don't know, just much more chatty, because it's less threatening when you're kind of just going for a walk together or something. So for me, the most important thing is never pressurizing him that he's got to say something, but always keeping those lines of communication open, so that he ultimately knows that if he does hit problems, he knows he can speak to me or he can speak to Dorina. That's massively important.
Definitely. I just wanted to say something. I'm actually happy that you've kept that relationship going, because I was thinking about me and my mum. A point came where that relationship started fading, where I couldn't come and ask you for questions or answers, and I had to turn to the world. And that's what necessarily happens when you should be able to ask your parents, but you know, that relationship starts to fade. I don't know when it starts, whether it's that when you say the teenager point, it's that I don't want to go to you anymore, but that relationship should always be there.
Yeah.
Support.
He still does look up for answers elsewhere now, ostensibly on YouTube.
Yeah.
But I just want him to know he can still come to me
exactly.
at some point.
Exactly.
Yeah. One thing that I want to talk about is women. So partners, women, girlfriends. Have you ever received a piece of advice from a particular woman in your life that's really helped you get through something? Have they shared something? Or is there a quote that has stuck with you? How can the women show up for you?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard. I can look at it from two sides, where I've had support from two different women, one being my ex-wife and one now my current partner. Was like, my ex-wife's love was unconditional. You know, I couldn't have asked for a better wife during the times that I had suffered through my illnesses, through my heart attacks, you know, even through my, you know, after my heart attacks, my alcoholism, you know, she could have left me, and she should have left me many times over those years. But her, like, she was worried sick about me, you know, and although she should have left, like, she put my health over her own, and it to her own detriment. But if it wasn't for her, that unconditional love that she showed me, I would have been dead, 100%, you know. And that went on through all the times I was very ill in hospital. She was at my bedside day and night, you know, and I have a lot of gratitude. And you know, she's an incredible woman, my ex-wife. She really is. And so her unconditional love is still something to this day, which I find incredible. Like, it's mad, really. And I'm grateful for her. But like my new partner, she loves the vulnerable side that I bring today. And she encourages growth, you know, and that means spiritual, that means personal development, whether it's business or.
And how does she do that?
By allowing me the space.
Mhm.
She gives me that space, but she holds me while I do it, so it's a beautiful combination because we're both very open. So like she like to whether is supporting me on me wanting to maybe go on a retreat, or like when I was branching out into being a keynote speaker, I'd gone from a rugby player to like all of a sudden speaking in front of people was not something that I ever imagined in a million years I'd end up doing. But she was very corporate. She'd been in events, and literally she basically like it's mad how the world works, right? Like it puts people in your path, and she was most definitely on my path. And she's just been an unbelievable support to help me so much to where I am today, like with business, with personal life, with my kids. Obviously, her coming into a newly broken home during lockdown on the back end of such a horrendous experience for my own children through my alcoholism. And then to obviously have a new partner, which was quite soon for them. So it was traumatic almost to an extent, for dad to be with a new woman so soon after the marriage broke down. So like there was so much complexity to it. But, and in a way as a dad, you carry in that you're worrying about how the kids are thinking, how are you thinking, how is she thinking? And like, it was a lot for her to take on. She took all that baggage on too, because then there was a lot of, negative energy flowing from my kids to her. But it's just something,
So for anyone watching then who's thinking, you know what, I'm struggling, I've kept it hidden though, I'm doing this in secret, substance abuse or addiction, or I just feel depressed, and they have never shared this side of themselves with their partner, what's their first step? What can they say? How do they start having that conversation? Because you're right in what you said earlier, that you can't force someone to open up if they don't want to. So if somebody wants to, but they don't know how to express themselves, what would your advice be there?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really scary thing if you've never really opened up about it before. And, say it is, and as someone who's, had an alcohol issue for a number of years, and particularly the last few years, and, quit nearly a year ago, it's quite scary the first time you sit down, whether it's your other half or whether it's a close friend or a family member, whoever it is, and admit to having that kind of problem. But it also might be equally hard to sit down with someone and just say, I am wrapped with anxiety. I can barely do my job anymore, because you'll be partly thinking, I don't want you now to feel scared on my behalf that in no time at all I may not be able to do my job anymore. What's the impact going to be on us and our family and family finances? You start to overthink things. I think for me, just personally, the safest way for me to do it is just to start with, I'm struggling. And you'd hope that your partner can then come back from that and say, okay, so what are you struggling with? I think we're scared to initially sometimes to name what it is, particularly if it's something that there's a lot of shame around, what Lean's been talking about. I think back to my relationship with alcohol, particularly after the events of 2017, when that was my go-to self-medication, when I was struggling with, loneliness at night when Ethan was in bed and struggling to just the pain of grief and the pain of everything that had happened. It was the way I self-medicated. And there's a lot of shame around that, the deception, the hiding it from him, the putting it in a Diet Coke can and adding it to Coke so that no one ever knew you were drinking until the sudden started to see a change in you. So the first time you admit to a struggle like that is hard. And so to say, I'm an alcoholic or something, maybe a step too far, but to say I'm struggling may then lead you to the next place. We can say, okay, what are you struggling with? I'm struggling with depression, or I'm struggling with dark thoughts, or I'm struggling with panic attacks, or I'm struggling with alcohol, whatever it might be. For me, that's it's a softer way in, but it's not kind of avoiding it. Do you know what I mean? It hopefully opens up a conversation. I think just quickly coming back to what you were saying in terms of how women can support and things that women can say that help. I found my wife Doreen is just, I know it's one of the love languages, but words of affirmation are really, for me, really important when I'm struggling. And I remember this from nearly just over a year ago, and I do a few Premier League games for Amazon Prime, and I'd done them the year before. I hadn't done games for 3 years after everything that happened. So that first year went back, it was a big moment for me. I've not done this for 3 years. Can I still do it? I remembered all the horror, mental health problems from 3 years before. And that first year was absolutely fine. And last year, ahead of my first game, everything came back. And it was utterly horrific. Panic attacks. I'm floods of tears on the phone to my agent saying, I can't do this. I can't do this. Eventually got through the first game at Manchester United, and I was at Newcastle the next night. And just in my hotel on the morning of that next game, having again proved to myself I can do it. The morning of that first game, I got to such a dark place that I was on the 6th floor of a hotel in Newcastle. I wanted to throw myself out the window. Now, I can't really explain how I got to that place so quickly. And it was really the words of affirmation. You know, Dorina could only do so much 200 miles away down in Buckinghamshire. I'm up in Newcastle. But what she did is, whilst listening and trying to understand what was happening, it was those words of affirmation again. You know, you are good enough. You know you're good enough. You can do this. You are strong, even though right now you feel weak. And that's a really powerful thing, because I think sometimes when other halves are going through something, or a friend's going through something, we feel like we've got to have all the answers. Sometimes it's not about finding the smart answers. It's just about reminding them of things. And she reminded me in that moment, and kind of all the way through that conversation on the phone, you can just feel like the dial coming down, the dial on the panic attack beginning to come down, the heartbeat beginning to lessen. And I get myself to a place where that evening I went and did my job, and no one would ever know, and I felt absolutely fine. Thankfully, I've never had a repeat.
Now, another thing is, we have all used our stories to fuel us and to push us forward. There is something to be said that some people out there, they hold on to their story and they feel that their narrative defines them, and they use it to not push forward. So you have written books and songs and set up charities. So having said that, what would you say to anyone sitting in front of you if they're actually holding on to their narrative and letting it define them, so much so they're actually using it to not push themselves forward, to not grow?
I'd say that they're stuck in the past. And, you know, our past does not define us. If you want to just constantly live in that regret, that shame, that remorse, that memory, that event, whatever it may be, like, you know, you're going to get stuck there. And those same feelings, those same emotions, they're just going to keep coming back. You know, things are going to get worse and worse and worse. So, like, for me, it was parking that, you know, getting out of that mindset, changing that perspective, you know, starting to become more present, become more conscious, like, start to see the abundance that I had in my life, instead of seeing the things that I didn't have, like, what are the things I did have, you know. And it took me to lose everything to actually to see it. But when I then began to start addressing my past, to start making amends where I could, to begin forgiving other people, you know, establishments, but also most important part was forgiving myself, because I had so much carried so much baggage around that, and that took me a long time. It took me years, literally years. But the more I kept putting the past to bed and stopped carrying those low vibration energies like guilt and remorse and shame, like, it was just a game changer. You know, just a complete game changer. And then, you know, it just changes your whole life. And then when you have perspective change from that kind of victim to more like that growth, like, you know, all of a sudden, like, the world just changes for you. And then literally you can begin to manifest your existence the way it should be. Instead of living in the past, you're now living in the present. You know, and you can start to create a positive future, because when you're constantly living in the past, your future is never going to be great, because you're living in terrible low vibrational energies. So I can't encourage people, like, no matter what you have done, does not matter, it can be forgiven. But the important and the hardest part is to forgive yourself, and to surrender. Like, acceptance, radical acceptance is the number one thing for moving on from things that's happened to you, or also things that's happened to your loved ones. Because like, if resistance to life is suffering.
Yeah.
So like if you can surrender to that moment, to that thing, to whatever it may be, which is hard, right? So hard. It is the number one thing for moving on.
Yeah, forgiving yourself, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Okay, take away.
Yeah.
That's a big one. That's one that everyone struggles with. I struggled with that a lot.
Mm.
When I got section, I couldn't get my head around the fact that like I was there,
Yeah.
especially being like the star.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense. Like, why am I? It just I couldn't let go of it.
Beating yourself up.
Beating yourself
mentally.
up. It's us. It's not normally us getting forgiven from like a higher power. It's us beating ourselves up that we struggle to let go of. And the question you said, Scarlett, I think to help, what helps is like if you put yourself in a perspective that you're sharing your story to help other people. Because some of my friends see me doing talks like this and they're like, how do you get up there and do it? And I'm like, if I just come up here to do it for myself, then I'll be nervous and having a panic attack. But when I think about the person at home watching this, what they can take away, it just takes away all the anxiety.
Yeah.
It just adds a bigger purpose on top of it. If I did it for me, I would never come up. I probably wouldn't have shared my story till this day. But I realized the importance.
But in telling your story, certainly in my experience, you actually begin to understand why your story is the way it is.
Yeah.
And one thing I've had loads of in the last few years is counselling. Now, I know that's not for everybody, but it helped me in telling my story to my counsellor on a week-by-week basis. I began to understand why my story had become what it had.
Yeah.
And for many months after the mental health issues that I had in 2017 that led to me crashing at Sky and having essentially a mental breakdown. It was only by telling that story, whether it was to my counsellor or to others, that I began to understand why that story happened in the first place and why it played out in the way that it did. But that could only happen by telling that story.
Yeah.
And then I began to understand it's okay. I now know what happened. I know why it happened. It's because I never really dealt with the stress of the job I was doing, which is not, a really important job is not presenting football, but it comes with scrutiny. It comes with doing it in front of the public. It comes with pressures. It comes with that imposter syndrome of feeling you're not good enough. And loads of things, if you don't recognize them, you don't deal with them.
Yeah.
They build bit by bit by bit by bit. And in that autumn of 2017, it's like my mind just went, and then everything flooded out. And then I find myself in just an absolute mess and breaking down and then off work.
Yeah.
But only by telling that story to myself and to my counsellor and to others as the months went on, then I began to understand that story. And I was doing a mental health talk earlier today to a company. I can now talk about that in a way that I could never do 4 years ago, because I understand now what happened. The understanding came from telling the story. And picking up research, there's great release from that, because it means you're not imprisoned anymore by it, you're released by it. And some people think, they'll look at it wrongly, and particularly when it comes to grief, they go, oh, you're still telling the same story. You're stuck there. No, I'm not actually. It helps me as much as it helps others to tell it, to understand what it's like, and actually to remember what it was like, and therefore be more appreciative and full of gratitude for where I am now.
And the people that are saying that, it's not for them.
No.
It's not for them. That's why they can't understand it. Why is he telling that? But a time will come. A time will come where they'll be like, oh, I need everything he's talking about. Because my friends were saying that to me when I first got section. Oh, your music's depressing. Oh, what happened to you? You were so cool with it. And then the phone call came. Oh, shocked. I need your help. You know what I mean? So sometimes you're like the trailblazer to a certain degree.
And it can be lonely, right?
It's extremely lonely. Luckily, my manager helped me through, but it's extremely lonely.
So how can you then support other men? Because we say a lot, you need to look out for the symptoms. But would you argue that some of the symptoms that you experienced weren't the traditional symptoms or signs to look out for? For instance, the world was shocked when Robin Williams took his own life, genuinely, and people said, we had no idea he was suffering, that he was in pain, that he was struggling. So are there any non-traditional symptoms or anything that you have seen in others or that you did yourself that people picked up on or didn't?
The reason why it's tricky is because you can't start diagnosing it until the person has spoken. That's why it gets really tricky, because until they've actually shared the story, and then you can start picking it apart and saying, okay, this is what's wrong there. You're spending too much time. Do you know what I mean? And picking until it's been said. So that's why conversations like this are so important, because we're trying to make it cool for you to say it, because it has to be said before you can really get to the bottom of it and find out. So it's getting them to share that story.
I think ultimately it's with some it's going to be impossible, however well you know them, how much time you spend them, to pick up on it, unless you become a clinical psychologist or a counsellor or someone who's trained in picking up on these kind of things. What I hope is that by having conversations like this, by there being a growing narrative around mental health, and particularly men's mental health, is that actually it's not about so much us picking up on the symptoms, it's about people who have the symptoms feeling that they have the freedom to talk about it. I've shared this story before a few times, but it's always the one, particularly when we're talking about this, that I always think back to, which was a cameraman we worked with when I was on Blue Peter many times on all our foreign trips, called Will, who's an amazing Australian guy, just brilliant, absolutely brilliant what he did. And about a year after I left Blue Peter, he took his life, threw himself off a cliff in Melbourne back in Australia, and he wasn't with his wife anymore, but he had a 10-year-old son called Jared, who he absolutely adored, and he had a great job and he was wonderfully talented, but he threw himself off a cliff, and obviously hugely shocking. And we're like, why? Yeah. And then it began to emerge that Will was bipolar. Now, Will had never told anybody he was bipolar. Now, looking back, I can look at traits in his behavior from all those many weeks we spent abroad over the years with him that I look back on now and go, oh, I can see what was happening there. Like he would reduce the amount of time he ever spent on his own to the minimum when he was on foreign trips, which is why he was always up very late in the bar. You know, he'd always stay with you to the end. So if you had a day off the next day, but Will was up at 6 a.m. filming, he'd still accompany you in the bar till 2 o'clock. You're thinking, I've got a nice lay-in, Will's out the next morning. And sometimes it'd be really late and say, do you want to come up to my room and just watch some of the outtakes from the films today? And he never liked spending too long on his own, because when he was on his own, that's when the demons and the black clouds began to gather. And he had that period on his own in between jobs back in Melbourne, and it all became too much. And I've thought about that so many times down the years. Should I have picked up on it? Would I pick up on it now, given how much more I know about men's mental health? The honest answer is I don't think I would have done. And I don't think I would. But what I would hope now, and this is why these conversations are important, is that Will would have been able now to actually not fear that by admitting he's bipolar, that means his work dries up, that people aren't going to want to work with him anymore, that he could have opened up, and then people would have been able to keep. Listen, there will be signs with some people. That withdrawal that my producer spotted was really important, but I think to put the onus on, we've got to somehow spot it. Sometimes it's going to be impossible. I think it would have been impossible with Will for us to really have ever gone, oh, he goes to bed really late, he must be bipolar. What I wished had happened, that Will was in a place where, and it was a climate back then where he'd have gone, this is me.
Yeah, I mean, it's so deep, right? Like, we're the best actors ever. Like, we'd all have Golden Globes and Oscars. Like, it's incredible, like how well we hide our problems. And but I can't help but feel that. I mean, you've only got to look around. Yeah, I mean, I could pick 5 of my best friends, and I could tell you they're all struggling in some capacity, just from their, you know, their weekend habits, and their cycles, you know, that they're in with their lives. You know, by the time it gets back to the weekend, they're overworked, not present enough with their family, and even when they're at home, they're on their phones. And then over the weekend, they're getting drunk. Then they hang over on a Sunday, they're doing kids clubs. Like there's, dude, and it's like, it's crazy, right? But I think as a whole for men, like there's a huge issue, I believe, in the world. Like this is a societal problem with men and identity in this current society, but finding our own community. Because like, if we don't find a healthy community, like we're going to find a tribe. And if that tribe's in a rugby club or a pub or a nightclub or whatever it may be, we're going to go there and we're going to find it. And whether it's healthy or unhealthy, like we're going to find a release. So a lot of it for me is just about having a healthy healthy way of finding community, tribe, and expressing in a healthier way than by going out and getting drunk or taking drugs or, you know, sleeping with women or prostitutes or whatever it may be, right? Because that's, people use different tools to escape, right?
Yeah.
And you know, there's the same habits you see in all around all the time. I see it a lot now, and I just feel that for men, we're really lost. So we're really, you know, there's a massive identity problem going on. And if we can just find a way, find a community, find more of these conversations, more people being vulnerable, more people being honest, finding community that they can relate to. And for people, it can be different things, right? For some people, it's expressive art. Some people, maybe it's walking mountains. Others, it's going in cold water immersions.
Yeah.
Maybe it's like a baking club, or but there's different ways we can express, you know, because when we lose sport, and take it from me, like that identity and that loss of that sport.
I was going to say, when that heart attack happened, as well as your career going, did your identity go in that moment as well?
Completely. Like, you know, sport is not who you are. Sport is what you do, it's not who you are. But mine was interwoven. And then when I lost the game through my heart attacks, it was just complete loss of identity, complete loss of purpose. And then with my health deteriorating and my reluctance to talk about how I was feeling, my emotions, my like that doubt, that negativity, that living in the past, that constant negative looking into the future, not seeing a positive outlook to my future. You know, I expressed through alcohol, or escaped through alcohol. But now I know that to have been, it was disastrous, you know. But identity is so important, and having a good purpose, you know, understanding why we get up in the morning, and having these ways of venting and finding that community, that healthy way, the health community is so important, I think. And it's gonna be a massive help moving forward to have these types of hubs or you know, environments for men to feel like this is completely fine.
Yeah.
And we're literally creating like the new rules. Because my album's called the album I'm working on, well, it's finished. It's called Vulnerability is the New Cool.
Is it?
Yeah. And it was me like understanding how cool vulnerability is. And I'm like, oh my God, I need to take this to the world and be like, yo, we've had it all wrong all this time. Like, vulnerability is the coolest thing. I'm just listing out all the cool things about it. I realized like my best friend I call him my best friend because of vulnerability.
Yeah.
If we didn't have that deeper conversation, he'd just be one of my associates. But what made him my best friend is because we went deeper and now we're best friends. Even when you saw your parents cry for the first time, you didn't like it, but it brought you a bit closer. It's like, I saw my dad, do you know what I mean? Or my mum. So vulnerability is a beautiful thing, and people need to see the coolness, because that's the only thing that's happened, is that these things, the reverse has become cool. Boys don't cry. We've seen it so much times. So we need to just flip it and show them the coolness of vulnerability, and then hopefully a new era.
I'm going to ask a really horrible question.
Oh,
Really horrible question, because there are going to be some people watching this who are grieving, who have lost someone, who are going through divorce, who have gone through a relationship breakdown, who maybe have lost their house or a child, and they're thinking, why not end it all tomorrow? All of this, everything I'm feeling, rather than putting in the work, why? I want to hear from you. Why is it important to get to the other side?
Because there is another side. There is another side. But when you're in the midst of grief, particularly if it's traumatic, I think, you know, I lost my dad a couple of years ago, and Dad was 76. You know, immensely sad to lose a parent, but he had a good long life. It's kind of the expected end of life to pass away. Obviously, losing my first wife 5 years ago very suddenly, to a totally different type of grief. She was only 40, and Ethan's only 8, and we've only been married 11 and a half years. It's a very different type of grief. But that kind of grief feels as close to true darkness as you get, and you can't see. I had one obviously massive reason for living and for trying to find the other side, because I've got an 8-year-old boy. But believe me, there were 2 proper times when I didn't want to find the other side, and I did come very close to ending it. And I don't say that with any pride or anything. It's just the honest truth. I did, because grief at that stage felt what it felt like is that the only tiny bit of colour left in my life was Ethan, but the rest of the painting, if life's a painting, your life so far is this big, beautiful, rich, colourful painting. It's like that moment 5 years ago, it sucked pretty much every last bit of colour out of life. So it's just functional. I will get up to get him to school, to get him back again, and it'd be lovely to have a hug with him, and that's amazing, beautiful and stuff, but this just isn't how life's supposed to be. And so you will have that period where the fog is so intense and the darkness is so intense that you can't even begin to imagine there's another side, let alone ever believe you can kind of even get there. And that's always the hardest question I ever get asked. Often, but every now and again I'll get a question on Instagram, someone will DM me and say, look, this has just happened. You found life again, but I can't. How am I ever going to find it again? And I always say to them is that it's impossible to believe this right now. It's impossible probably to even see it right now, but as sure as night follows day, it will happen. I cannot tell you when you will get there, but some of that's down to you. Some of that is down to you, because I know people who've gone through similar things to me who've never emerged from the shadow of grief, because actually they didn't want to, that they wanted to stay in that place and have never moved on from it. You have to decide when you go through something like that you want to find the other side. There has to be an act of will in it. It's going to be incredibly difficult, and for the first few weeks and months and maybe beyond, you're only going to be able to manage to crawl. So it's going to feel like this is just really, really hard. And at times it's like walking through this mountain pass, and you have this horrible, horrible climb, and you get to the top and you're in agony, and then it's the downslope and the sun shines for a moment, and then the next mountain appears. And that's what grief's like in the early months. It's just constant things coming at you, constant battles you've got to overcome, whether it's about your future, whether it's about what you're going to do with your work, whether it's worries over your children, whatever it might be. But there is always another side. You just cannot see it. And at the time, you don't know what that side will look like. But there is, because everybody goes through loss. And loss comes like, I was so happy to hear you list those other things, because we just think loss is death. Yeah. But grief comes in lots of different forms. Grief comes in the loss of identity that we were talking about. You grieve over the loss of a relationship. You grieve over not maybe being the father or mother you imagined you were going to be. Grief comes in lots of different forms, but there's always a way through it, and there's always another side to get to. But part of that will be down to that will that you're going to find it.
Amazing. And I think that leads into very well into our questions that have been submitted.
Yes. So we've got a quick question. There's a few questions. One of them is, how can people spread awareness about men's mental health?
Social media.
Yeah,
Social media.
Social
just be
media is a
open,
great tool.
be honest, be open, start a conversation with your mates.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah,
Starting. Someone has to step out
yeah.
and be the red Indian that goes over the hill, comes back and says, "There's stuff going on over here."
Yeah.
Someone's got to do it.
Yeah.
You just got to step out.
Masculine environments as well, because it's so powerful what everyone is doing here, and everyone here is doing groundwork. But it also has to come from managers and CEOs, and it has to come from the top of the pyramid as well. So in those typically masculine environments, we're in your cubicle where you think, well, I can't talk to the guy next to me. Yeah. So I think that's important, to have the conversations, but in typically, or in a football stadium.
And the conversations are building. There's momentum gathering. I won't say which company it was, because that'll be unfair on them, but I spoke at a very famous law firm in London before the pandemic, one of the Magic Circle law firms, so a big one. And during the talk I spoke about imposter syndrome, which can be exhausting for all of us. We were talking about putting those masks on, but that feeling that you're just not good enough to be doing what you're doing. And I spoke about how I felt that in the job I had at Sky, that I wasn't really ever good enough to be doing what I was doing, and it's exhausting. And it will fill you with doubt, and it will fill you with fear and anxiety about doing your job. And I finished the talk, and I was just getting ready to leave, and the CEO of this law firm So in the world of law, this guy, I didn't know Madam before, but he's clearly a big honcho, came up to me. He said, I've been working here for 32 years. I've been at the top for the last 12 years. He said, I struggle with that every single day.
Wow.
And I was like, wow,
Yeah.
wow, these are important conversations. I said, listen, I just said, I'm so glad you as a company are having this conversation because it builds momentum. You see, if they do it, then one of the other Magic Circle companies think we should be doing this. If
Yeah.
Sky are doing like they were around the time I left, then other companies, and it's about momentum. So the more things we do like this, you know, it's not going to solve everything, but it gets the conversation going, it builds momentum. So more people think, actually, we're missing out on something. We're missing a trick here, not addressing like we're doing tonight, men's mental health.
Yeah.
So it's about just keeping the momentum going. And
Yeah.
social media is a very good platform for talking about that, but it's obviously not the only platform.
This is a good question. This is a good question. If you can go back and give yourself advice on masculinity at 16, what would you say?
That's a belter.
I think that applies to both of you.
Yeah.
To, you know, to speak your truth. I think so many times we just, certainly for me as a young man, you know, I was seeking acceptance, you know, not knowing that that's what I was trying to do because I had a fear of rejection. So, you know, people pleasing, doing things that wasn't really in my value system, but just kind of trying to fit in and just going with the flow. But a lot of the time, maybe not saying what I wanted to say. I think masculinity in my world was slightly warped. It was kind of narcissistic almost, you know, and very sport culture led, you know, which was great because I was in that. But there was a lot of men that weren't, you know, and yeah, I think we could live in a much healthier male like ecosystem if we were just more honest, more vulnerable, you know, spoke our truth, you know, take off the masks, just be who we want to be. Do you know what I mean? But be men of value. For sure. Not you know, men with no integrity. Like our society, unfortunately, at the moment is almost like promotes these kind of narcissistic role models. And it's a big problem,
yeah,
you know, because it's a huge disrespect to the feminine, and it's something that needs to change, man, you know, because there's a lot of good men out there, you know, but we're getting a terrible rap, and but it needs to change wholesale, and like it begins with, you know, we all, or none of us are born with poor value systems. We're just conditioned and domesticated into the human beings that we are today, and our society is driven, unfortunately, currently by that narcissistic type of culture. So I'm a big believer that, you know, that a healthy male, a man of honor and integrity is integral to society, and that comes with, you know, respecting society as a whole, in particular the feminine, and you know, if we get that right, we got a great chance of turning around the current state of affairs we find ourselves in the country right now.
Scarlett, I think that's it.
Are we out of time? It's gone.
Oh, one more question.
One more.
2 more questions. Okay, one more question.
Let me see.
Oh. I'm worried about the
Whoa. Which male stereotypes has impacted you the most?
Gosh, which male stereotype?
I think I'd contribute body dysmorphia.
Oh yeah,
The amount
it's
of
huge,
men,
isn't it?
yeah, because you know, there are so many issues, depression, anxiety, BDP, all of this, grief, loss, but this is the one that comes up no matter who I'm talking to.
Especially
It's-
young men.
Yeah,
particular.
it's body dysmorphia. It's that now we're having a conversation surrounding the female body, and we are celebrating women of all sizes. For example, Rebel Wilson we did, Lizzo we currently do, and yes, women have been attacked in the media. You can look at when Kim Kardashian was pregnant, for instance, and I could genuinely go on and on and on. But you take men and physically what they're told to aspire to look like, that's something that I have always found, no matter who I'm talking to, that always comes up. Body dysmorphia.
Yeah, I mean, it's conditioning, right?
Yeah.
It's social media, it's porn. And like, we've got a big problem in our society right now with young men in particular watching a hell of a lot of porn. And like, it's murdering their self-esteem. Like, seriously, like, it is not good for their self-esteem. It's causing body dysmorphia, confidence issues, you know, and then double chuck that into social media. Like, I'm working in the education sector in South Wales, and I can assure you, like, you don't think that this would be an issue associated with young men. But I would say, as a whole, I think it's slightly more men that are having issues with their bodies and how they look than even women. And this has been a quick change in, like, you know, the last few years. So I mean, yeah, it's a huge, it's a scary part of society.
Have you watched the latest Jonah Hill, or it's really new Jonah Hill documentary on Netflix? If you haven't watched it, I would recommend it. But a lot of the issues that he has experienced has stemmed from the body dysmorphia he had in the way that he looked when he was young.
Yeah,
That's crikey. Well, I knew we were getting into trouble on this, is when a Facebook ad appeared on my Facebook page a while ago, because I downloaded the Facetune app. You know, we can change it because it's quite funny to do funny stuff. No, I use it for funny stuff. But the body one, I didn't realize there was one for your body. So you can essentially take a male body and you can sculpt a six-pack and put pecs in. It's like, wow, we've arrived somewhere we never thought we'd arrive at. I remember doing a charity football game, actually sat in a dressing room very similar to this at another football club about 5 or 6 years ago, when all this was beginning to really take off. And there were a number, it was one of those charity celebrity football games. And we had a number of YouTubers on our team who I'd never heard of. And there were about 5 of them. And they, as we got ready to get changing, go out and do the end, they stripped off. And me and Chris Sutton, who used to play for Norwich and Chelsea and Blackburn, we were sat there, and I remember Chris just going, "What the hell has happened here?" Because these guys were just sculpted, like they were early 20s and sculpted. And that's, I've seen that in my nephew. I've seen it, a little snippet in my boy already, talking about six-packs at the age of 13. I didn't see a six-pack in the whole time I was at school. I saw some very fit guys, like rugby playing guys who were fit and good at what they did, but there were no. And I think, you know, going too long, I have a massive worry about that. And it strikes me we've got a mental health time bomb, particularly amongst young men, that's beginning to tick and beginning to show signs it's going to explode soon.
Is that all of our questions? Amazing. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.